Here we go. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today, Understanding the Immigration System, Statuses, and Supporting Students. Before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. Please leave your cameras and microphones muted throughout the session unless you're asked to unmute. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. Ivana Hansen is the director of the College and Career Readiness Department at Nash Community College in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science with an international relations concentration from Tulane University and a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages from American University. Ivana started her educational career in the District of Columbia Public Schools as an English as a second language teacher. She has also been the education director for the Sylvan Learning Center, taught secondary social studies, and taught as an adjunct English as a second language and adult basic education instructor in both Maryland and North Carolina. Ivana served as the Career Pathways and Transition Coordinator for the CCR department at Nash Community College, where she helped establish certified career pathways in advanced manufacturing and healthcare. Ivana has served as a trainer of other educators throughout her educational career for both the K-12 system and community college system in the areas of ESL and integrating career readiness. Ivana has served as a coach for the Golden Leaf Scholars Leadership Program, as chair of the Eastern Region Adult Education Directors, and on the state advisory boards for adult, high school, and Latino Hispanic initiatives, as well as the NCCC-AEA Conference Planning Committee. When not at work, Ivana spends her time fixing up and sitting on the porch of her historic home in downtown Rocky Mount with her two teenagers. Without further ado, I'll turn you over to Ivana Hansen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry for all my technical difficulties. My bio hasn't been updated with my new position, and I've only been here this is the end of week 2. So navigating new technology and new computers and everything new is a little bit crazy. So thank you for being patient with me. I'm actually in my new position. I am coordinator of the REACH Collaborative, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here at the system office. But I was at Nash for a long time. And I'm going to preface this whole presentation by saying I am not a legal expert. I am not an expert on this at all. I'm just somebody who's worked in this field for a very long time, and I do a lot of research on this area. So please feel free to have questions. And I was going to start us off with a little Padlet, but because we're so late, I'm not going to do that. So, but in the chat, if you want to just take maybe 2 minutes and just tell me who your immigrants are. Who are the immigrants in your area, in your school? And if not in your school, in your community? So who do you work with? What do you know about your immigrants? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to put it in the chat. It's possible we lost everybody. Okay, yep. Majority are Latinx, yep. And I think that's going to be the case with most of North Carolina at this point. ESL, ELA at AB Tech, 80% Latino, yep. All right, and yay, another ESL teacher, yay. Latinx, Hmong, good. Romania, interesting. You have a good number from Africa. So this is a very mixed group, and I think that's important. So that's one of the reasons that I do this, because we tend to assume that all of our immigrants are Latino, and even more, a lot of times we'll assume that they're all from Mexico, but really not. And I see people on the call from all over the place. So I'm going to be a little North Carolina focused, but not super North Carolina focused. And some of the information is stuff that you can go and kind of find out for your own population if you are so inclined. So let's talk about North Carolina immigrants. So what do we want to say about them? So what we're going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about North Carolina's immigrants. The main categories of immigration: barriers to education, some higher education opportunities, ways to assist our students, and then on-campus safety a little bit. And I'll interweave a little bit with storytelling. And if you have questions or you just want to chat about something, please feel free. It's exciting seeing all these people from all over the country in here. I love it. Oh, we've got a group of Afghan refugees. Okay. One of the things I'll just mention, while I was on the one of the earlier sessions, we were looking at data, and one of the things that I've read about a lot recently is talking about our Asian students and how they tend to perform really, really high up on most of the metrics as far as completion and graduation and all that. But it's very interesting for those of you who have a Hmong population or Cambodian population or Karen, so to try and disaggregate some of that Asian student data if you have a big enough population, because once you start disaggregating amongst the different Asian countries, you'll see a lot more difference in there. So just something to mention. So I'm going to start here with the melting pot versus the salad bowl. So for a very long time, we talked about the US being a melting pot. And people still say this, right? The United States is a melting pot. We come here and we all get mixed together in this big, huge pot and we stir it up together. Okay, well, what's the problem with that? Sometimes, and I think about color, if I put some red, some green, some yellow, some blue, some purple, all those colors in a pot, what's going to happen? What color am I going to end up with if I mix all those colors together? It gets muddy, right? It's going to be brown. And especially for this presentation, we want to say brown is beautiful, but maybe not when we're trying to look at all the individual colors. We still want to be able to see our individual colors and, you know, enjoy that yellow sunrise and look at that orange sunset. If we throw everything all into a pot together and stir it all up, then we'd lose that beauty. So the salad bowl theory, if you want to move from the melting pot to the salad bowl, is it's still a delicious, perfect combination of all these different flavors and textures, but you can still taste the individual ingredients. And I think when we're talking about working with our students, that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that our students feel like we're acknowledging that they are lettuce or that they are a tomato, that they're different. We're not all just mush in one pot together. That's not how it works here. So I like to think about that. All right, we're going to go over a whole bunch of terms. And the reason I put this presentation together originally, I did this at Nash when I was there. There's so much misinformation out in the world about immigration. We know it's a very politically hot topic. And sometimes, or oftentimes, when it's a politically hot topic, things get misconstrued very easily. People say things wrong, people don't do their research and don't know. And I hear a lot of wrong statements frequently about our immigrant students. And I just wanted, so that was the goal of when I put this together. So some of you may know all of this already, but there's a lot of people that we work with that don't know this information. So immigrant education laws, these are the two big ones. So Plyler versus Doe said that in the United States, we must educate K-12 students no matter where they come from, no matter if they're here legally or not. It's against equal protection if we don't give them the equal opportunity of the law. So that was the first big one. And the second big one is Lau versus Nicholas. And so that one says that in addition to Plyler versus Doe saying we have to serve them, we also have to give them extra help with English if they need it. So that's why there are ESL programs in schools, because the government has recognized that they need extra support, just like we give extra support to other groups of students. So North Carolina immigrants. And I tried to find a chart of this from the 2020 numbers, but it hasn't quite been in there yet. But I think it's interesting when we talk about our immigrants, we tend to think either extremely highly skilled or extremely low skilled. And there's a lot of in the middle there. So if you look at our North Carolina immigrants, you can see that more North Carolina immigrants have a college degree than US citizens in North Carolina. A lot less have some college, okay? High school diplomas, almost the same number, and then less than a high school diploma. So that does kind of read that theory out a little bit, that there's a high number with a college degree. There's also a high number with a less than a high school degree. It's really important when we are working with our students that we really know our students' stories and their education level, because there's, again, a common assumption is that they don't have education skills or they don't have educational background, but it's not necessarily true. I have had multiple students with advanced degrees, doctorates in my English as a second language classes, and they would be sitting right next to students that had no education. So just knowing that there's a big mixture out there, and immigrants are not one monolithic group by any means. And then some other information about, again, North Carolina. We're up to 8% of our residents are immigrants. We have 7% that are native born with at least one immigrant parent. And I read an article this morning that said the biggest growth in Hispanic residents in North Carolina now, according to the last census, is actually by birth. So not by immigration, but we've eclipsed that by birth. And then 39% are naturalized citizens. So a big chunk of our immigrants in the state have become citizens of the United States. We're going to talk a little bit more about DACA later, but there's over 24,000 active DACA recipients in North Carolina. Most of the people that were eligible had applied, about 64% as of 2019. And DACA residents in North Carolina paid about $58.6 million in taxes. One of the common misconceptions about immigrants in the United States, whether they're legal or not legal, is that they don't pay taxes. And that's a very common, very common misconception. So I thought this was an interesting stat that said, undocumented immigrants, not even just regular immigrants, undocumented immigrants added $377 million in federal taxes and $262 million in state and local taxes to North Carolina. And one thing people don't realize, that many immigrants pay into the Social Security system, and it's actually keeping Social Security afloat these days because they can't get it back if they're undocumented. And then just knowing that 1 in 9 workers in North Carolina is an immigrant. And we have 12% of our businesses are business owners. So we're bringing in billions and billions of dollars in income every year from immigrant state. And I'm sure for my other states out there, it's the same. So Nash County, when I first put this together, Nash County is where I worked. So I just wanted to show you, sometimes when you do a deeper dive of your own little data in your own little area, you, excuse me, find out some interesting things. I thought it was really interesting that almost a quarter of the immigrants in Nash County are naturalized citizens at this point, and over half have been here since before 2000. So that's a long time. That's 20 years, 21 years that they've lived here and been part of the community. And then our population's diverse. I mean, like many of you, most of our population, the biggest percentage is Latinx, but we have a pretty substantial growing Asian population, African population, and European population. We have a large Arab population in Rocky Mount as well, that's growing. And one of the things I also would task you to look at is when you start looking at your countywide data, do a deeper dive into some of the census tracts. So for example, if I go back and I look at Nash County, right, only 4% of Nash County is foreign born. But if I do a deep dive, I can go into certain zip codes where it's much higher percentage. And as for marketing and outreach, if you think about, targeting specifically those specific areas, you can target different groups of people that may not be getting it through general word of mouth. So there are 4 ways to become a citizen. And again, I'm sorry for those of you who know this, but we can all use a review. 1, you're born in the US. Okay? I was born in the US. The day I was born, I became a citizen of the US. I could be born to a US citizen parent, or my parent became a citizen before I turned 18. I could be adopted by a US citizen, or I could be naturalized. And that's the process that immigrants go through. So someone in the US who is not a citizen is either an immigrant or a non-immigrant? Does anybody want to guess what the difference is between an immigrant and a non-immigrant? You guys are quiet today. Everybody's eating probably. Non-immigrants don't plan on staying. So they're here for a visit, right? They might be here for 4 years to go to college. They might be temporary workers. Oftentimes in the summer, we'll bring in temporary workers to work in the fishing industry and work in sales and at the beach, things like that. They could be other visitors to the US. They could be visiting your husband or your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, okay? But they're not immigrants. So anybody here on a student visa is not considered an immigrant because their plan is to leave. It might not be their actual plan, but that's what they've indicated as their plan. Immigrants, on the other side, they settle in a country intending to stay there permanently. So they want to stay in the country that they're moving into. Okay, and there's 3 categories of immigrants. So there's lawful permanent residents, refugees and asylees, or undocumented immigrants. So all 3 of those are types of immigrants, immigrant being somebody who moves to a country with the intention of staying there. So lawful permanent residents or legal permanent residents, you can use either term, okay? They have permission to remain in the United States for as long as they choose, as long as they remain crime-free. Okay, and they must renew their green card every year. So you don't get a green card and they give it to you and that's it, and you can stay forever. You have to go through this process every 10 years to renew it if you want. Okay, so it's not really a permanent solution until you become a naturalized citizen. Refugees and asylees are people that leave their country because of nationality, race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a political group or some other kind of group. The only difference is where they apply for the status, okay? So refugee is somebody who applies to move from the home country and applies prior to moving. Okay, so these are people that are in like camps in foreign countries. They fill out an application to come to the United States and they're approved or denied based from afar. Okay, asylum seekers are those that enter into a country and request asylum. Okay, but it's the same group of people basically. It just depends on how they request to become a refugee or an asylum seeker. And I just always think this is overwhelming, an overwhelming number, but 1 in every 113 people on earth is either an asylum seeker, internally displaced, so sometimes they have refugee camps in your own country, or a refugee. 1 in every 113 people. So look around your colleges next time and think about how many people that might be and how impactful that is on somebody's life. So undocumented immigrants. Okay, so not students, not visitors. These are people that are in the United States. This is the 3rd type of immigrant. Okay, so again, you had your lawful permanent residents, you had your asylees or your refugee seekers, and 3rd, you have your undocumented immigrants. Okay, so undocumented immigrants may have entered the United States without a visa or green card. They could have come without that piece of paper at all. They may have come in on a visa, but stayed past the time that they were supposed to leave. Or they may have crossed the border, okay? And it's interesting because we always talk about the border, the southern border, and that tends to be where the most of the focus and immigration revolves around, right? But 62%, the vast majority of undocumented immigrants in the US come on visas and then stay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so it popped up and said I was muted and then I had to unmute. Okay, anyway, I'm glad you can still hear me. So again, undocumented, they may have entered with or without a visa. They may be here with expired papers and they just don't have documents that give them that lawful permanent residence or asylum to stay in the country. So what is DACA? DACA is something that's talked about all over the place. It's in the news a lot, and probably many of you are familiar with students that have DACA. So DACA is called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was announced by President Obama back in 2012. What it is, it's not, contrary to popular belief, it's not an executive order. Deferred action is a policy that the United States Immigration Services had for a very long time, right? They've always had the ability to defer prosecution, defer deportation for certain people. What Obama did is he just expanded that to a whole group of people. I always like to give the fun fact that one of the first people that, or most famous people that had deferred action in the United States was John Lennon. So though he wasn't a DACA recipient, he had the precursor to that, which was just an individual deferred action. So he could live here and have no fear of being deported, although he wasn't a legal resident. So it's not a law, it's not an executive order. It is under court order to continue, only for students who already have it. So that right now, the way it is, it's been fought in the courts, it's going back and forth. The Supreme Court put a stay on it, saying that when the Trump administration tried to get rid of it, they did not do so with due process. So realistically, the Supreme Court has not even ruled on the validity of the program. They've only ruled on the validity of the process of the program. So we have this stay in place where we can continue to renew, students can continue to renew their applications, but they're not accepting any new applicants. So this was designated for some dreamers. So those words get interchanged a lot when we talk about DACA recipients and dreamers. A dreamer is generally an undocumented immigrant who came to the US as a child. So before they came 18. There's an estimated 3.6 million dreamers in the United States. They're called dreamers because there was a bipartisan bill many years ago called the DREAM Act that would have legalized them or give them a pathway to citizenship. And it's never gone through Congress, unfortunately. So because the DREAM Act didn't go through when it was being discussed, that's why the Obama administration tried to do something in the meantime to help this certain group of people. So in the United States, there are over 640,000 people that have current DACA licensure. There would be another 61,000 aging into eligibility if they were accepting new applicants. So again, you have to be a certain age to apply. So if they hadn't applied yet, they could have become active DACA recipients, but because it's on hold, that is no longer an option. You can see how many there were that were DACA eligible. There's 150 birth countries represented by DACA recipients. And North Carolina has the 7th largest population of DACA recipients in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit more about DACA. So what makes you eligible for DACA? So you had to be under 31 on June 15th, 2012. That was the day that it was announced. I affectionately call it DACA Day because I remember that day very strongly in my memory, sitting in my classroom, hearing this news and talking with my students about, the opportunity that it might give them. You have to have come to the United States before you were 16. You have to have lived in the United States since June 15, 2007. You can't have left, so you can't have gone back and forth. You had to be physically present in the United States on that day, on June 15, 2012. You can't have had a visa or anything like that on those days. And then you have to either have completed school or be currently in school. It can be high school equivalency or high school. So you have to be in one of those programs. You have to either completed high school or complete a high school equivalency or be working towards it. And then you can't be convicted of a felony, significant misdemeanors, anything like that. And they're pretty strict about that. So what does it give you? It gives you a 2-year renewable work permit. Okay. It gives you a social security number so that you can work, but it says for work purposes only on it. Gives you a driver's license. That was a state-by-state decision. I believe that all 50 states now issue driver's license to DACA recipients. When it was first announced, it kind of went back and forth for a long time between yes, no, maybe. It gives you deferral from deportation. So as long as you keep your clean record, your clean legal record, then they will leave you alone basically for those 2 years. It also gives you the opportunity for advanced parole. And this is something that was really meaningful for a lot of students because prior to this, if you were a DACA recipient or undocumented, you couldn't leave the country safely. There was no way to travel overseas. So for our university friends, especially that do a lot more study abroad than we do, knowing about advanced parole is an important thing because now these students can get permission to leave the United States. Now, is it a good idea? Don't know. I can't make a judgment on that. I know for a while it got a little scary coming back into the United States. So I'm not sure what the status of that is right now, but I know that advanced parole is something meaningful. There were a lot of people that when they got DACA was the first time they could ever go back and see their grandparents or see people that they had left many, many years ago. But what are the limitations and challenges of DACA? So again, it has to be renewed every 2 years. It costs hundreds of dollars. I believe the last time I checked, it was about $800 for the application. And that's just for the application. So that doesn't include the fact that most people pay lawyers to prepare them for you because the immigration documents you have to be so particular about it. And they're very onerous and difficult. So most people do hire attorneys. So then you're talking a couple $1,000s every 2 years. The immigration system's a mess. So you never know how long it's gonna take. So it's almost, for many of these students, it's almost like they're in this continual cycle of applying over and over and over because you don't know if it's gonna take 6 months to get approved or not. They also you have to have background checks every time. So every 2 years, you have to go back to your local officials and federal officials and do a fingerprint and get a background check and make sure you haven't done anything in those 2 years that would then make you ineligible, but that costs money as well. I'm really fascinated by this concept of liminal legality. And basically what that is DACA gives you some rights. It gives you some legal rights, right? But it doesn't give you full legal rights. And there's a lot of work being done about, well, what does that do to a person? I mean, just your psyche, regardless of how it impacts your day-to-day life, but how does that impact you in your mental health, knowing that you're sort of legal, but you're sort of not. DACA recipients are not eligible for federal financial aid. Okay, they are not at all. Can't get a loan if you're DACA, okay, or a grant from the federal government. And then all the states, because higher ed is controlled at the state level, so all the states have their own policies about higher ed, okay, and about whether DACA students can be involved. Okay, so click, there we go. I like this map because I think it's really interesting to show how our population of immigrants has changed and how interesting, you can go back and study all this immigration and how each generation there's a new group that's kind of been vilified as the scary immigrant coming over. But I think it's interesting to look at our map from 2013 and how, I mean, it's almost symmetrical where we're getting our immigrants from, which I think is fascinating. And then the total foreign-born population in the US in 2013 was 40 million, 13% of the population. Well, that's a lot of people. So why do we care? Why do we need to know this? So it's important to know where people come from, right? Knowing the story of how they got here. Trauma-informed processes. You wouldn't believe some of the things that people have to go through to get here. And I think back again, think about that refugee number, right? 1 in 113 people is, a refugee or displaced or an asylum seeker. It's amazing. Like, that's a lot of people. And, you don't become a refugee just because. So there's reasons, and there's life, and there's terrible traumatic things that have happened to many, many people. Understanding family backgrounds. What can your family, what do you add to this community, to our culture, right? And that's not me asking, that's me, I want you to share that. Bring it into my classroom, okay? Make it real for me, because we're educators. Our job is to educate everybody to make the world hall better, right? If we don't learn from each other and we don't learn about each other, it's really hard to do that. And then we perpetuate these misinformation and all that kind of thing. Yeah, understanding the struggle, I said already kind of, but trauma, if you've got training in trauma-infused practices, this is where this comes in. And one of the things that's important to mention is it's not just the past immigration trauma, right? So I, taught students that came when they were 10 years old, and they had some, actual immigration trauma, meaning they got arrested and were in facilities and then got let go, and they can tell those stories. That's a piece of their background and story. But also think about what's happening now, right? Because the immigration, most of these students, especially the DACA students and the undocumented students, right, they still are dealing with this. They're still dealing with the pressure of the immigration system, whether it's in regards to them, whether it's in regards to their family members and they're scared about. So it impacts every piece of their life. There's actually a theory out there called Undocumented, and that's the #1 caveat of that, is that undocumented immigrants deal with fear all the time. The fear of, is somebody going to come take my mom away tomorrow? Just imagine living with that. It's important for us to help educate and inform, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of negativity out there. The only way that gets better is by all of us working together to change that context and change that conversation. It's very important to help our immigrants navigate schooling, and that may be our first generation immigrants, it might be our 1.5 generation immigrants, it might be our second generation immigrants. The American school system is way different than most any other country. Any country, right? So navigating that system, and I see questions in the chat, and I'm gonna come back to them because I'll lose my train of thought, and I'm already discombobulated today already. So, but having people that can help them navigate that system, using your community resources, using the people in that community to help that have successfully navigated is really important. Somebody was talking, I think, on one of the presentations yesterday, the people at Surrey that do amazing work with their Latinx population, talking about, there's a fine line that we walk between FERPA considerations, but also involving the family. And we have to understand culturally, having your family understand what you're working with or what you need to do is part of the decision-making process. So these 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds or 30-year-olds that are new to an education system are going to ask other people around them for help. They're going to rely on their family to understand and support them. So it's our job to not just educate them on the process, but we need to educate the whole family. We don't have to break confidence to do that. And really, there's a lot of research out there that talks to successful undocumented or documented immigrants and says, what made you successful? And it's really important that the navigators, who are the people that help them get through this process? Who are the people that, didn't brush them off when they said, I don't know how to fill out the FAFSA, or my mom, can't come in to help me do this? Who are the people that sat down and worked with them? Those are the ones that make that impact. I'll go on in a minute. And then a lot of times your counselors and your ESL teachers, so those of you who are in recruitment and retention, if you're trying to change this population, it's a really good place to start. I was an ESL teacher for most of my career. I probably knew all the families, all the Latino families in my school, because that was my position. Even if the student wasn't in my class anymore, the parents might have been in my class at the community college, but they students find people that they know are comfortable. So, so knowing that. All right, mixed status. And this is, I kind of mentioned this a minute ago, but knowing that most of our immigrants and most of our students are in some sort of mixed status family is an important thing to know. So again, if you're talking about that violence or that liminal legality on people, again, you know, it's not just how does it impact the student, but how does it impact their family? About 4 years ago, we went through a period in North Carolina and many other states under the previous administration that we were doing large workplace raids again, right? So imagine, you know, your parents go to school one day and then you come home and they're gone. So knowing that and knowing that, you know, your brother, your sister, everybody might be legal, but there's probably somebody in your family that may not be. All right, so in North Carolina schools, who do we have? We have US citizens, but again, frequently in mixed status families. We have green card holders, okay, permanent residents, and we have undocumented immigrants. We have two kinds of undocumented immigrants. So we have those that have DACA. So again, they're partially documented, okay, and then we have non-DACA recipients that are just completely undocumented. So state by state. I love this graphic. I think it's really useful. So this is the tuition policies and access policies for immigrants, for undocumented immigrants across the United States. And this is updated in March. So you can see North Carolina is nice and white because we do not have tuition equity laws. So if you are not a North Carolina resident, and for these purposes, anybody that's undocumented, whether you have DACA or not, are not a documented North Carolina resident. So even if you have DACA, even if you're paying taxes because you've got a good job and a work permit for 2 years, and you've lived here since you were 1 year old, you are not considered a North Carolina resident for tuition purposes. So some states have tuition purposes, they'll give you in-state rates. Some states also have scholarships and funding. Some states ban you completely, okay? You see Alabama and South Carolina, undocumented students are banned. Georgia, I believe it's the Georgia University system, the students are banned, but I believe their community colleges, they're allowed. So knowing this and talking to students when you're working with students about, especially your college transfer students, where could you go afterwards if possible, or where could you go for schooling, or where could you move? I don't know. But knowing that North Carolina, again, no in-state tuition, no scholarships. So I have a couple of stories sprinkled. I think I missed the first one somehow, but I like telling a little bit about my students that I've had in the past. So Carmine and Jenna, and all these names are fake, but both came to the US when they were under 5 years old. Sister and brother. And they grew up with an abusive father. He went to prison when the kids were about middle school. The brother dropped out in 9th grade, I believe, to become the primary breadwinner for the family. He went to work in our town and started working in kitchens and probably cooked in 3/4 of the restaurants in Rocky Mount at some point in his life. Both he and his sister have come back at different times to try and pursue the high school equivalency. Neither one of them received DACA when they could have back in the day because they didn't have the schooling requirements. So they had dropped out of high school and they were not enrolled in the high school equivalency program. So they didn't have the schooling requirement to apply for DACA. And then the law changed, or the procedures changed, and they're not taking new applicants. So, but Carmine, fake name, of course, he was arrested on a petty theft charge. This is about 1.5 years ago now. So arrested on a petty theft charge. Nash County is one of the counties, along with Alamance and a couple other counties in the state, that participate in the federal 287G program, which means that if you are arrested in the local town, they run you through immigration. So it's an automatic. They don't necessarily do that in other states. So when they run through immigration, they turned out he was undocumented, though he had lived here, again, since he was a child, never had legal trouble before this, was undocumented. So instead, and he went to court and got like misdemeanor probation for the charge. But when he went to show up for his parole hearing or his parole meeting with his parole officer, he was arrested by ICE and taken into custody. And he was put in a detention center in Georgia for about a year, and then he was deported to Mexico. He's in Mexico with a family that he doesn't know. He's living with some random uncle. He barely speaks Spanish, so really struggling. And the sister, who's still here, is now the primary breadwinner, and again, doesn't have time to come to school and get that high school equivalency because she's working all the time. So this impacts on undocumented students. They're not eligible for financial aid programs or federally funded programs. So not even just federal financial aid, but they also are not eligible for like WIOA grants or workforce development grants or any of those kind of programs either. Food stamps, any of that. The licensure issue for non-DACA recipients. So if you're undocumented, you don't have a driver's license, you know that you can't do much without a driver's license in this world that we live in. Again, no social security number, so it's hard to get IDs. We went through a thing a couple of years ago where, you know, we had to ID the parents when they were bringing their kids to school to register them, and many of our parents didn't have IDs. So they were being turned away, which is illegal, but it was fixed. I mean, what we ended up doing is having like the Mexican consulate came out one day, they have a mobile ID van and made IDs for all the parents in the community so that they had IDs. Oh, that's what it was. It was to get into the schools. They put, when they increased security and they put locks on all the schools, you have to show an ID to get into a school. And all of these parents didn't have IDs to get into the school. No work, if you don't have a work authorization, you can't do paid internships, you can't do fellowships, you can't get a regular job without that work permit. Now, that's not to say that many undocumented people do work. Okay, they work under the table, all those things. Most do, and you saw all that tax money that they add to the government, but just not recognized legally. They're not eligible for a lot of careers if it requires a licensure or a background check or anything like that. You can't travel somewhere with where an official ID is required because you don't necessarily have one. And you're not eligible, many students are not eligible to work in their chosen profession after graduation, right? So I say I want to be a lawyer, but I am undocumented. So even if I manage to make it through school and I make it through law school, I can't take the bar in North Carolina and become a lawyer because I'm undocumented. Okay, I'm going to stop right here for a minute and go look at the chat because I know I've been talking way too much. Jana said something about people not understanding the costs and time and red tape involved with immigration. Yeah, it's crazy. And I have a chart that I'll share with you if I can make my computer work. That's crazy. Jenna, I think that's awesome that you have specific DACA students. I think all the colleges should step up and start doing that. So that's a conversation that people can have when they go back to their places of work, because again, in North Carolina, we don't have that. So if you can get your foundation or somebody else to sponsor those scholarships, I think that would be incredibly impactful on a lot of people's lives. Yeah, everything's so expensive. Good. University of Kansas has a website for undocumented students. Yep. Thank you. UndocuCrit, Jana, I'll put that in here. I know it's a UndocuCrit. Let's see if I can find this. I think I'm going to send you guys out to breakout rooms if you have for a couple minutes. And what I want you to do is I want you, before I talk about these higher ed considerations, I want you in your group to talk about these higher ed considerations. So what are some things that may impact our students, either at the community college level, at the college level, in addition to just the financial aid piece. So what are some things that, you know, you're going to see amongst your students, or you have seen? So if my lovely moderators, Lisa, if you could send them to breakout rooms, would that work?
Sure. And tell me again how long you want them to have?
Let's do 5 minutes.
Okay, great.
I can put these things in.
Hey, Lisa. Hey, Renita.
Hey, Jennifer.
Lisa, I know you're a great student, so I hope that you are paying attention. What are we discussing in here?
You rely way too much on me, Jennifer.
Sorry, this
We are-
multitasking thing.
I know, I don't know how y'all are doing it. We are discussing the barriers and the impacts of these things on some of these undocumented students in higher ed. Am I correct on that, Renita?
Yes.
Okay. So, and the things she had on there, I know she had financial aid put up there. What was the other one that was at the top there? There were only 2 bullet points and I can remember one. That's pitiful.
I'm sorry,
I don't know, the whole time I'm thinking of a student that I know that is in Concord High School in the fire program, very much wants to come here to RCCC, do the fire program. He is undocumented. He did not qualify for DACA and he's stuck. Does not qualify for financial aid and cannot become a firefighter because he cannot get a license.
Wow.
But is doing outstandingly well at Concord's program, and it is a feeder program into ours.
Wow.
But you know, the things he's running into is the financial aid, the driver's license.
Yeah.
You know, his parents can't help with anything because they are afraid of their status.
Right.
You know, it's barrier after barrier after barrier for him. I've
Mm.
talked to him at length about it.
Yeah, in the early college program, you know, because we're a high school program, like they can get their 2-year degree, but we have students that graduate with their 2-year degree and then they can't do anything else because they're undocumented. And so I've had some students that, I mean, they're trying to work through it. And so they're taking a gap year to try to become citizens. So that they can move on because, you know, they're brilliant students. They've got an associate degree.
And that's this student. I mean, a great student, hardworking, good kid. And, you know, I've racked my brain. You know, being in TRIO, we know a few more resources than most.
Yeah.
And darn if I can come up with anything.
Yeah.
You know.
So I'm curious, I guess North Carolina is, we're white regarding, you know, college funding. Does that apply to private schools too, though? Because I thought Catawba and Salisbury was doing some
The
scholarships.
private schools are different. The private schools can function differently, but it's anything that's state funded.
Okay.
Any state money, any state grants, none of that. Can't touch any of that. So NC Works, none of that. They can't participate in anything.
So if private schools want to do something, it comes out of their pocket, basically.
Exactly. It has to come out of their pocket. So, you know, it's just very difficult. And for him, it's the license issue.
Yeah.
You know, and his instructors are working with it. And, you know, you talk about the process to become a citizen. You know, we had to do paperwork to get the citizenship paperwork for Hope and our other son. Oh my Lord. It's a nightmare.
Yeah.
And they were already technically citizens, but just to get the paperwork, it's incredibly expensive. I think we paid about $800 for just a piece of paper. I mean, it's just I don't know, frustrating, but
That's on top of adoption,
well, yeah, that was a whole nother ballgame.
really expensive. So it's
Yeah.
like, wow.
But they have to have the piece of paper or a passport, but you can't get the passport without the documentation that they're a citizen. You have to have that piece of paper showing that they're a naturalized citizen in order to get the passport.
What strikes me too is that, navigating those systems to get the paperwork completed, that I think is a huge barrier for a lot of people.
Exactly. And I think, yes, I think navigating the systems and navigating them without fear,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
that's a huge issue.
Yeah, agree.
The fear of discovery.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
Deportation in the process.
Yep, exactly.
Well, it looks like we're going back to the main room. I've enjoyed this.
Thanks for doing what you're doing, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Welcome back, everyone. Looks like we still got 15 seconds, so I'll wait 15 more seconds. Looks like room 1 and room 2 are still chatting. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. And I would love, some of you have your cameras on, you left your cameras on. I don't know if that'll mess us up with Zoom, but I would love to hear from a couple people. You can unmute and just tell us what you talked about. What are some things that you see or you see might be challenges or you've had run into?
Hey, were you testing? Oh,
Carla, there's a girl that's long.
Anybody want to be brave?
She lives over in. It's hard to hear me. I can't.
Okay, I don't think that they were answering the question.
I think she got it.
Yeah, we had a great conversation in our group about barriers that our students have faced that, like in our early college, they can get a 2-year degree, they can get an associate degree, but then they can't do anything else. So, some of my students have taken a gap year to try to get their citizenship, and they're trying to work through it that way. Another participant in our group was talking about, a local high school student who kind of is in a similar situation, that all the barriers and the paperwork to getting their license so that they can continue with the program. And we're talking about brilliant, brilliant students who would be super successful.
It's interesting too, because there's a lot of undocumented students, maybe not as much anymore, but I know when I was still in the classroom, many of them didn't find out they were undocumented until they were going to try and get their license.
Right.
So everybody around them, their friends are getting their licenses, and that's when they first have to have that sit down conversation, because it's not something that parents necessarily talk to the students about, right? They don't really, when you're young, you don't have to deal with the consequences of it. It's interesting because I know many students who have, we think undocumented, but many students who have never been undocumented, because when you're under 18, you're not legally responsible for being here legally or not legally, right? Because you're a child. So many people were under 18 when they applied for DACA at first, and have had DACA their whole lives. So they've never really had that complete feeling of being illegal, but they also have no way of just fixing that and adjusting it. Anybody else have anything to share? All right, well, we'll go through a couple of these things. So again, US citizens have no restrictions. They apply for financial aid. Your parents do not have to be legal for a child to qualify, right? Because the child is a US citizen. You have to complete the FAFSA, obviously. Many families will need help with the FAFSA. So if you want financial aid, you have to fill the FAFSA out. But the FAFSA is not easy. It's confusing, and it's even more confusing when you don't know what to put. So there's questions that will ask for your parents' social security number. Well, if your parents don't have a social security number, do you leave it blank? Do you put zeros in? How do you fill out that document? So there's a lot of complicated, FAFSA is an issue. There was a fear during the Trump administration, they put in some, or they were trying to put in some requirements that said that basically your family member could never access any of the federal money, basically, right? So you couldn't ever access Medicaid or Medicare or anything like that. And, FAFSA is a fear thing, right? So here I am filling out all this information, telling the federal government where I am, what I do, what my social security number is or isn't. So there is a fear about that out there in the community as well. Scholarships are available for US citizens, obviously. There's a lot that are first-generation college students, so giving students that extra bit of support as a first-generation college student is important. RDS can also be a huge barrier. So we know the RDS system is flawed. And if you're 18 and still living with your parents and you have to fill it out and your parents aren't legal, then it's going to flag you. It's just what it does, even if you are. So going through that system and, having to, because you can appeal RDS decisions, but does everybody know that? And how do you do that? Okay, so DACA students. The first group was US citizens. Here are some DACA students. So DACA students may enroll in North Carolina public education if they graduated from a North Carolina high school or a North Carolina homeschool or a North Carolina adult high school diploma program. If they come back and get their GED or their HiSET or any other high school equivalency type program, they are not legally allowed to enroll in curriculum programs in North Carolina community colleges. So let me say that again. So you think about these students that have dropped out, okay? They've dropped out of high school, now want to go back to school and get their high school equivalency and better their lives. They finish their high school equivalency and then they cannot enroll legally, even if they could afford it, they cannot enroll in a curriculum program at a North Carolina community college. Basically, we reserve those spots for documented US citizens. I agree, Jana, I don't know. And I will argue this all day. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it's kind of disappointing that we're not allowing people to come back, or we're discouraging that. They're not eligible for in-state tuition. They're not eligible for many scholarships. There's a lot of scholarships. I don't know about y'all, but there's a lot that you have to be a US citizen. Not eligible for professional licensure, and they're not eligible to join the military. I want everybody to know that, because when DACA was first passed, there was one of the qualifications you could qualify if you had been in the military. There used to be a program called the MANVA program. I think it still exists, but it's been like totally cut, basically. And that was for students with exceptional language abilities, but it's only languages that we seriously need. So like Farsi and Arabic, there was no option for Spanish speakers to take advantage of that. So joining the military is not really an option for most people, even if you have DACA. So suggestions for high school graduates that do have DACA. And I worked on this a lot. So promote your continuing education programs. There's no residency requirement for Con Ed programs. Tuition is more affordable. Again, there's no in-state versus out-of-state tuition for the Con Ed programs. Short-term training makes it less expensive. So really, getting people into these short-term high-value programs so they can get a credential is really important. High need and high pay programs, IT, electric line, even CDL might be a little wishy-washy because of the license having to be renewed every 2 years. But there are some high demand, high pay programs out there that you don't need a state licensure for. So students can take advantage. One of my former students went through the Electric Line Academy with us at Nash and finished that and works for the city of Wilson now. So looking into those programs, they are eligible for certification programs, not licensure programs. So, and it depends on the program a little bit. Just make sure you do your research. Don't guide a student into a program that they're not going to be able to get a licensure or a certification from and work with. EMS is open, teacher assistant, electrical, HVAC, all of those are open in North Carolina. Yeah, no, not allowed to join the military, Jen. I know it's crazy. And they are eligible for some continuing ed scholarships. So specifically, I'll point out the, I can't remember what it's called, the one about the tobacco, former tobacco trust money. I can't, it's escaped my brain right now. But there is a scholarship out there specifically for farmers or farm workers or parents of farm workers or children of farm workers. So that may apply to a lot of your students. So look into that. Gear phones, I think we could use for DACA programs for some of those students. So really looking into that and going back to your, again, what we said before, go back to your foundation and have that conversation about, here's this group of students, you know, what can we do to help them? High school graduates with DACA, okay? For 4-year bound students, many schools, if you fill out a paper FAFSA and mail it directly to the financial aid office, schools can make their own eligibility determination, whether they qualify for financial aid. Many of the private colleges especially will offer a significant amount of scholarships to DACA recipients. There's a big push on many campuses to diversify your campus. So this is a good place. So don't let the fear of private colleges scare everybody away, because again, many times they will, they'll qualify for even more financial aid or any financial aid, because the private schools have that ability to work around things. But some of the public universities will do the same thing if you apply directly with the financial aid office as opposed to going through the FAFSA. And then there's scholarships. There are a lot of scholarships out there. The dream.us gives a lot of scholarships, but there are a bunch more out there. Other things, they can get sponsored. So in North Carolina, the one way around the out-of-state tuition is to have a business and industry sponsorship. So if I work for a company and that company wants me to get educated, they can sponsor me and pay my tuition and get the in-state rate for that. You could make a deal with your employer that you pay them back. I don't know, but that is an option out there. So that's one way to get around the in-state tuition, is that, but the checks have to come directly from the business, however your college handles industry sponsorship. Apprenticeship, there are public apprenticeship programs that some students with DACA might qualify for. There's also some private apprenticeship programs out there. I have a good friend who went through a program called Road to Hire out in the Charlotte area and got tech trained, and now he's one of my examples at the end. But students can take one class at a time. If that's what they can afford, let them do that. I did hear that some schools will do like private college funded work study on campus for DACA recipients. So that's something else. So if your school's having a trouble finding work study and you've got some money in the foundation and you could pay some DACA students to do work study on campus, that might be helpful. Suggestions for high school graduates without DACA. So private schools, again, the private universities oftentimes will take the students. Again, one class at a time, and as much as you can, if you can encourage them to stay in high school, because again, if they drop out and they get that high school equivalency, that's limiting their options even more. There's also some programs out there. Lisa is sharing some of my resources with you guys in the chat. I will also be happy to answer any questions afterwards, but I have a chart in there that kind of shows what I put together for these different categories. So US citizens, DACA recipients, and undocumented for North Carolina, and just kind of what they're eligible for and what they're not eligible for. There are some great programs working with the students. Latinx education, I think is what it's called. Latinx, I can't think now, but that's on there as well. One of the things that they're mentioning and encouraging students, there are some private open source universities that you can go and take a lot of your general ed classes through this open source university, and then maybe possibly take that back to your college and get credit for prior learning if you can do a credit for prior learning assessment. So that may be something that colleges can look into, is what is your credit for prior learning policy? Do you have exams that students could challenge exam if they went and took these courses at this free open university? Could then they come in and take these challenge exams and get the credit? And then for everybody, encourage CCP as much as possible for our non-North Carolina people. That's College and Career Promise. That's your high school and college programs together. So in North Carolina, you can start taking college classes. It used to be just junior and senior year. You can actually start younger than that, freshman and sophomore year, taking free community college classes at the same time as you're enrolled in high school. This population is a great population to encourage for this, but it may not be the population that's being served in this program right now on your campus. So that's something when we talk about equity, we can go and look at. So, Hispanic students have the lowest number in our college, I can't say R anymore, but in that program. So doing some targeted intervention and getting in that community and really explaining the benefits of those programs are really important because they're fee waived. Students can take classes in the summertime. Continuing ed is now included in this. So again, think about your Con Ed programs and your pathways. What certifications can we get for these students now that they could maybe transition over later? Yeah, so a takeaway for me is that students can't learn if they're afraid. So what are we doing on campus? It's one thing to get these students in the door and them be able to pay for school, but once they get there, what are we doing for them? Respect a student's confidentiality, never out a student as undocumented. That's a traumatic thing. If they trust you to tell you, then hold that trust, because it's a scary thing. Again, you don't know what could happen under any administration as far as any of this policy. Identify allies on campus. There should be some people on your campus that understand some of the things that this population goes through, that can help them navigate, that can, if somebody comes to me and says, well, oh, we're going on a field trip to Canada next week, and the student comes and says, well, I can't go. Having somebody that understands why that is really important, because imagine having to announce that in class that you can't go on this field trip because you don't have legal papers to travel outside the country. So having people on campus that understand some of these challenges and have some capacity for working with students through some of these challenges is really important, and making those people known to the students. One of the things, I think we all need to do is, do we have Spanish speaking staff on campus? It's, who can, because especially for things like this that are so serious and so intense, a lot of times people will want to revert back to their native language because they're talking about things that are personal and really impactful, and it's harder to do that in a language that isn't necessarily your native language. So what supports do we have for students to speak in their native language on campus? Pay attention to the language that's used throughout campus. Again, try not to use illegal, alien, undocumented is a lot friendlier and a lot more realistic, right? We're not aliens, and I will always say that no human can be illegal. An action might be illegal, but a human being can't be. And then think about your inclusive spaces. intersectionality is really important with the immigrant experience because, again, many of these students are growing up in very like intense different pieces of their world, right? So they grow up feeling like Americans in many cases. They feel like an American. They take part in all the American activities. School is Americanized, and then they go home to an immigrant household where they're different, right? Their parents might not understand the school activities or they don't understand the schooling. And then they get to this point where maybe they can't do anything else. They can't go on. They can't keep studying because they've hit this wall. So really going through that. Mixed status homes, again, make sure you understand that your students are in mixed status households. Create opportunities for advocacy. We saw a lot of advocacy in the last couple of years with Dreamers. You know, students feel connected to their school if their school feels connected to them. You know, again, advisors need to understand the financial implications and limitations of DACA. You know, not knowing and giving wrong information is very detrimental. And then I'll just tell you another one of my buddies. This was my guy who went through this Road for Hire program. So he came in 5th grade. His parents were both farm workers. When he was a senior in high school, he came out as gay, which was a big transition for his family that is historically Catholic and Mexican and very traditional. You know, his family didn't have money. He tried to self-finance his classes. So he would pay for one class at a time at a couple of different community colleges, but really just wasn't getting where he needed to get. So he applied for this Road to Hire program, which was a 6-month paid training program specifically designed for students who might be undocumented or have DACA and placement. And now he makes more money than I do. But again, he still lives in this constant fear of what if DACA goes away, right? It's still in the courts. The Supreme Court, again, hasn't determined, you know, what the program means and if it can stay or not. So what happens next? And something else to think about too is when you're dealing with your students, and especially those with DACA, that they can come in and out of status pretty easily. Like we talked about, they have to renew every 2 years, and it can take up to 6 months to renew. So you think about if your paperwork doesn't come and all of a sudden you're not legal anymore in the middle of class, right? Because your driver's license is tied to that work permit. So if your work permit expires, so does your driver's license. So all of a sudden you can't drive anymore, right? All of a sudden, if you're working, you can't work anymore. So I know people that have been laid off for a month or 2 months because they can't work legally anymore. So just knowing that that's a potential source of trauma for students, you know, and could be made worse by some of our interactions and some of the ways we address students, right? Well, why can't you do that? What do you mean you can't drive anymore? Well, you know, things like that. So just understanding all of that. I will say, just to close up, I shared a bunch of resources. A couple of them, one is the documents I put together about scholarships and things, and you know what's eligible, who's eligible for what in North Carolina. There's another one that is one of my favorite graphics, and I'm going to print it out and make it a poster someday, but it shows all of the different pathways to immigration. So it'll say, you know, did you come as a child? Yes, and it'll send you this way. So I would open that and look at it, and then you'll understand how crazy is the process. And I'll just say, just real quick for a plug out there, my new position, I am the coordinator of the REACH Collaborative here at the system office. So one of our goals is to increase Latino population enrollment and completion of credentialing by 2% in the next year, basically. So if you would love to work with us, please get in contact. If you've got good ideas, those of you that are in other states, if you guys have ideas or things that have been successful or things in North Carolina that have been successful. I listened to Surrey people yesterday, and they're doing amazing work out there with their Latinx population. So, you know, and remember that I fall back on Latinx because that was my most population, but we are very diverse in these states, and we have diverse needs, and there are a lot of refugees out there coming into our schools, and they have different needs than others do. You know, so really just have a kind heart, an open heart, and when you hear misinformation about the immigration system and you think, oh, that might not be right, do the research for yourself and find out and share that information back out with your friends and colleagues, because I think the only way we ever change and get to a place where we have some kind of immigration reform in the country, however that looks, is if we continue to have these conversations that are based in reality. So I will close on that note. If anybody wants to keep this conversation going, please feel free to get in contact with me. I'd love to hear from you. You know, this is an absolute passion of mine, has been my whole life. You know, and I hope that you got something out of it and learned a little bit of information, and go back and look anew at your immigrant students. And really think about what do they bring into our campuses? What, you know, we're moving towards this, you know, diverse population. Our population is more diverse. Are we celebrating that diversity, and are we reflecting that diversity in what we do? So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here with us today. And folks, I want to invite you to jump over and join the closing remarks. If you accepted the conference on your calendar, it should be the link that I just put in the chat. I hope that works. But it will be the main conference link if you registered for that. So thank you again, Ivana. We appreciate the valuable information.
Thanks, ladies.
And we'll see you all in the closing. Thank you.